Hey everybody, it's Monday at 8:30, and you know what that means? It's time for the PastorCast from Sunlight Community Church. It's Pastor Bill with you tonight, and we've got a great show coming right up. But first, this.
Skittle-a-do, I said bim bop. Skittle-a-do, I said bim. Skittle-a-do, I said skid out and bop. Skittle-a-do, I said bim bop boom. Skittle-a-do, I said bim bop. Skittle-a-do, I said bim. Skittle-a-do, I said skid out and bop. Skittle-a-do, I said bim bop boom.
All right, welcome to the PastorCast, where we're connecting people to God so that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, like the intro says. Scott is not with us this week. He'll be back next week as he and I launch into a new series all about worship, and in particular, why we do worship the way we do at Sunlight. So that's coming up next week, and that'll be great. But tonight, we want to start with this simple reminder that we're collecting peanut butter for Grace Packs. Thanks, Jake. So if you have in your house, or you want to go out and buy just a ton of peanut butter, that would be such a blessing to this ministry. They've recently expanded now to where they're in 30 local schools, helping children who are in need, who might be hungry otherwise on the weekends, to have nutritious meals. So we're asking that you support this ministry by bringing 16.3 ounces or smaller, just the regular size of peanut butter. You can drop those off at our church office during the week, or you can bring them with you on Sundays and leave them at the information booth. Now, what are we going to do for the rest of the show? It's going to be a different kind of show. If you were in church this Sunday, you know that I preached, and you know that we tackled a really interesting text, Ephesians 5, about how our marriages as Christians are to be formed and patterned in a certain way. This was part one of our new sermon series, Different, 7 Ways That Jesus Changes Everything. And Jesus does make a difference in our marriages. Dr. Carl Rogers said this famous quote, "If 50 to 75% of Ford or General Motors cars completely fell apart within the early part of their lifetimes as automobiles, drastic steps would be taken." But what are we doing to fix our marriages? What are we doing, especially as Christians, to have better marriages? That's the topic that I tackled on Sunday, and came to this conclusion. That your love story exists to point people to the greatest love story ever told. In other words, your marriage is not random. In fact, all of your relationships aren't random, but God has created them with a purpose. And the purpose for marriage is to display the gospel, to display this truth about how God relates to us, His agape love for us, His unconditional love for us. Just a special kind of relationship, this unity between Christ and the church, seen in the unity between man and woman. Now listen, this text is an interesting text. Ephesians 5 has been used and misused for a long time. It's the text that, of course, talks about submitting to one another. And in verse 22, wives submitting to their husbands. And it's a delicate text to handle, because, like I say, it's been misused for a lot of the history of the church, where men have used this text to dominate their wives and enter into just a lopsided relationship where they order them around and just assume that they can use them like objects. So I handled this text with a lot of care, and I took a lot of time in preparing this sermon and coming to the conclusions that I did. Tonight's episode of the PastorCast is kind of a behind-the-scenes look at how I came to those conclusions. And it's interesting for several reasons. First of all, a lot of you watching may be wondering, about that text in particular, why did you say what you did? Others of you may be just curious, hey, what do pastors do Monday through Friday? What goes into making a sermon? It's easy, right? Well, we're going to show you a little peek behind the scenes tonight at how you would take a text like Ephesians 5 and from it move into a teaching that we present on Sunday morning. And we're going to do that in a segment we call tonight's Spotlight. And we're going to start the segment here in my office, and we'll go back to the studio in just a second. But I want to see and let you see behind the scenes what pastors see as they prepare sermons. A lot of work goes into this. As you know, the Bible was not written in modern English or even King James English, but it was written originally in Hebrew and Greek. So it's important for us to, as pastors, know that language enough to see all the nuances in it and be able to bring that to you. We use books to do that, but we also use software. Software is just like books, but we don't have to go to a shelf and pull it off. It's all right in front of our face, wherever we are, which is great. This program is called Logos. It's pretty standard. A lot of pastors use it. You can see on the left panel here the Greek text that we looked at this week, and on the right, various English translations. Here's the NIV, here's the ESV, etc. Now, let's look at our key word for this week. This was a heading over the entire discussion, this concept of submission. And it appears in verse 21. If I highlight it in English, it sympathetically highlights in Greek, and you can see this is the Greek word. If I right-click it, I can do a lot of things, including see definitions. For example, this is defined as to cause to be in a submissive relationship, to subject, to subordinate. You can read about how it has kind of a military origin. Like in the military, you are ranked and filed, arranged by someone else. And that's kind of like what it is to submit. It's just to rank yourself underneath someone else, to think of someone as more important than you, better than you, to go with them first and put your own needs second. So anyway, this is a really interesting verb, because if you look here, if I hover over this in Greek, it's telling me it is a verb, but it's present passive participle. It's not a command, it's not an imperative. And actually the ESV gets this more correct. See how it translates it submitting. And it doesn't start the section with verse 21. 21 is part of the other section. And I talked about this in my sermon. I said the main verb is way up here. It says, be filled with the Spirit. And this is actually an imperative. So if we find this over here and hover over it, you can see it's a present passive imperative. That's a command. This is the command in our passage, even though it's not even in our key passage. Be filled with the Spirit. And out of that filling, then what happens? You're going to be addressing one another in a certain way. That is a participle. You're going to be giving thanks. That is let's hover over it. You guessed it, participle. And you're going to be submitting to one another. And we'll hover over that. Guess what that is? Participle. So the one imperative, the command for us, is to be filled with the Spirit. That's what makes us different. When God comes into our lives, when Jesus comes into our lives, He makes us different. And this difference looks like this, that we are joyful, thankful, and submissive. That's where that came from in my sermon. The fact that the Greek text has it arranged like this. So the ESV considers verse 21 to be the final part of Paul's thought that we just talked about. The NIV, though, considers verse 21 to be the start of this new section. And I can see both reasons why. Because if you read this whole thing, Ephesians 5:22 through 6:9, submission is the key concept that ties it all together. And so really, this is a weird verse. Verse 21 is part of the previous thought, and it's also the heading for the thing that comes after. That's why the NIV and the ESV are slightly different. Anyway, that's just a little peek at one of the insights that I gained from looking at the original language. Now, also in Logos, what we can do is search for the passage and see what other people think about it. I mentioned this in my sermon as well. Passages sometimes are hard to understand. And so within Logos, I have all of these commentaries, and these are very scholarly written works. Here's one of the best ones called the Word Biblical Commentary, and I can just read about what people have thought about this text and check to make sure what I'm thinking about this text is not way off base. All right, let's head back to the studio and we'll talk more about that aspect. All right, thanks, Other Bill. That was step one, original languages. So we're looking at the original Greek when we preach out of the New Testament, the original Hebrew when we preach out of the Old Testament. And we also need to look at the historical context as well, using some of those resources that I mentioned there. It's important to know that, Paul was writing to a specific group of people. He was a specific guy. They lived at a specific place and time with certain customs. And so we have to bridge that gap every time we preach a sermon. We have to look at the language then, the language now, the culture then and the culture now, the various customs then and the customs now. And sometimes there is quite a gap to be bridged. I want to look at an example before we look at our text for today. Here's an easy example, okay? What I hope is an easy example. Wearing veils. So if you read 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says this about wearing veils. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have had her hair cut off. But it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off and her head shaved, then she should cover her head. That is a really interesting text, huh? I mean, if we read that quote unquote literally and don't bother bridging the gap, if we just bring that wholesale into the world today, then every woman at our church is sinning every Sunday, because I don't see any women wearing hats or veils or anything else. But the thing that we all kind of know as we read the Bible is there are principles and there are applications of principles. And knowing the history here helps. So in this case, in Corinth, Paul was writing to a culture in a city where prostitutes did not wear veils. Women who were insubordinate and just wild were the only ones in Corinth that didn't wear veils. And so the principle he's teaching here is don't dress like a prostitute. And the way he told that to the Corinthians was, women, wear a veil. So the principle still applies today. Don't dress like a prostitute. The application of the principle is different today. Okay? So what does it mean today to not dress like a prostitute? I'll leave that to you to figure out. But that's one example of how we can read a biblical text and see kind of a weird cultural thing going on and have to ask the difficult question, does this directly apply to us today? Or is there a principle at work here that applied to them in one way and applies to us in a different way? Unless you think I'm just speaking like way out of turn here, our own denomination in 1978 said this: a distinction must be made between a moral principle and the application of that principle. The former is normative for the Christian life today, and the latter is not necessarily so. And hopefully you've seen that as we've discussed the simple issue of veils, whether women should have to wear hats to church or not. Okay? Next, let's apply this same line of questioning and reasoning and thinking to our text today. And the example is household codes. What we read about in Ephesians 5 is a household code. If you look at the history, household codes did not begin with Ephesians 5, did not begin with Paul, but they had existed 400 years before in the same exact form. So you can read about Aristotle, Plato, or Seneca in the 300s and 400s BC, writing about the household code with these same exact things. Husbands and wives, parents and children, slaves and slave masters. The household code was a cultural thing that Paul latched onto and taught about, but he didn't invent it. It was a cultural thing. And Aristotle and the rest were writing about them in this regard, that they were writing for the stability of the state, the polis, the government, the empire. And they said the most basic unit of the political state is the household. And so if there's order in the household, there's going to be order in the state. And that's how Rome can be successful. We have to keep order in the house to have order in the state. And so when Aristotle and the others wrote about household codes, boy, that's hard to say, household codes, they would write about husbands, wives, parents, children, slaves, and slave masters. But their writing was a little different than what Paul wrote. They would say something like this. A Roman statesman wrote, "If you catch your wife in an act of infidelity, you can kill her without a trial. But if she were to catch you, she would not venture to touch you with her finger. She has no rights. So, when we look at the household code in Greece and Rome, they were more along the line of women are to serve their husbands as objects of sensual pleasure, as discardable things that just follow orders with no rights. And the man was the head of the household in that regard. Now, what Paul does is interesting because in Ephesians 5 and 6, and in Colossians 3, and Peter also in 1 Peter 3, all of these New Testament passages are taking this household code that existed, remember, for 400 years, and they're stating it for their readers, but it's radically changed. It's no longer, guys, you're supposed to dominate and rule your house, but it's, guys, you're supposed to service the head of your house with love, with the other person's interest first. And even in this parent-child relationship, parents, you are to serve your children in this self-sacrificing kind of way, not exasperating them, but loving them, looking out for their best. And even the slaves and slave masters things, the people you have working for you, and by the way, in that culture, it's, Scott has said this, it's more like what we would today call employer-employee. That's a fair application of that. So employees, you're to work faithfully for your employer. But employers, you're also to have love for the people that work for you. You're to look out for their best interests. You're not to rule dominating with a hard fist, but you're to serve them and put them first. So you can see that when Paul used this pre-existing form of a household code, he did it in a radically new way. And he read into this household code Christian virtues like agape love, like mutual submission, like reverence and respect. Okay, so this creates a really interesting question. I hope you're tracking along with me. When we read that, what of that is principle that directly still applies today, and what of that is application of principle that will vary today? So you have several options here. Number one is just the straightforward reading of the text. So the man is still the household head, the woman is to submit, etc., etc. On the very far end of the continuum is another option that says basically this is all first century mumbo jumbo. We've come a long way since then. We're an egalitarian society now, and everybody's equal and everybody can do whatever they like, and none of this applies at all anymore. And somewhere in the middle is this idea that Paul read Christian principles into the household code of his day, so we need to read Christian principles into the household code of our day, okay? Now the question is, how do we choose from all the options of what is an enduring principle and what is culturally, embedded? Okay, and for that, I went to the literary context. The literary context. So there's this very simple principle as you're trying to determine what the Bible says, and it's this: we have to let the Bible interpret the Bible. Maybe you've heard this. It's so simple, but it's so profound. The Bible is the best interpreter of the Bible. There are less clear passages and there are more clear passages, and we have to let the more clear shine light on the less clear. So as I looked at the context here, I just determined that would be the help that I used to judge the authorial intent. What did Paul mean? What was he trying to communicate to these people? I saw several things here. I saw a reference in his work to Genesis 2:24. I saw that maybe what he's thinking is there's something in the way we're created, man and woman, that is just part of the created order. It's not a result of the fall and of sin, but it's that Adam was created and Eve was created, and they had roles. And the fall distorted those roles. In Genesis 3, you can kind of see what happened to those roles, that the man became demanding and ruling. And anyway, that's one thing I considered. Another thing is that Paul repeatedly, in the context of this passage, refers to Christ and the church, Christ and the church, Christ and the church. The man always being compared to the role of Christ, and the woman always being compared to the role of the church. And so that's not cultural as much as it is Paul saying, hey, in your relationships, you have roles that are modeled after this thing that we're showing the world, Christ and his relationship to the church. And anyway, there's a lot of other things in there, the parallels that Paul draws with the baptism, with the gospel, with even marriage rights. All of this just led me to think there are some things that are cultural, but there's a lot that transcends culture here. And that's how I came down in my sermon, that it's a mutual submission, but that the man is submitting to his wife and her need for love, and the woman is submitting to her husband and his need for respect. There's this weird blending of things where verse 21 is true. Everybody is submitting to everybody else, but it's within a pattern and an order that is unique. Lastly, I will put this on the screen, that no one interprets the Bible by themselves. And so part of what I did as well, besides doing all the original language work, studying the history, studying the culture, but I asked a lot of people. I asked Scott what he thought. I had lunch with a pastor who had been married for 53 years and had been teaching this passage for a long time. I asked him what he thought. I asked through reading the commentaries what all of these scholars throughout the years thought. I read people who were on all different sides of the spectrum, and that's an important part of the process of coming to your finalized interpretation. Okay, and that, by the way, is just part one of making a sermon. So understanding what the text is saying to us today is just part one. Part two is then determining how to make that memorable and applicable and interesting and understandable. And that's a little behind the scenes look at what pastors do Monday through Friday on the sermon alone. I want to end with this slide. Questions, comments, I would love to hear your further thoughts on this. I already received a few great questions. Somebody asked, you know what, I don't know about this Bible saying you got to love everybody better than yourself. I think I should be able to love myself first, because if I don't take care of myself, I'm not going to be there for the people that I need to love. And this person was a sexual assault survivor, sexual abuse, horrible marriage. So she also had this question about, hey, are we as wives called to just submit to anything, to a horrible husband who's abusing us physically, emotionally? There are a lot of things that I didn't address in the sermon because half an hour, you don't have time to address every possibility. I'm glad she asked the question, because the answer to this is no. I mean, you do not have to submit to physical abuse. That's harming the image of God in you. Submit to God before you submit to anyone else. Do what's right in God's eyes before you follow the commands or whatever of anybody else, any other human being. And with regard to loving yourself, I think the scripture assumes that we're to love others as we love ourselves. It assumes the fact that we are loving and taking care of ourselves. It's simply saying, as much as you love yourself and take care of yourself, have that degree of care for others as well. And here's the cool thing. If we're all in a society of people who are putting each other first, no you first, no you first, no you first, then when that works, ideally, we're all supporting each other. And there's almost no need to put yourself first because so many other people are putting you first. Okay, well that was a lot of content. This is a very different PastorCast, and I know some of you may have enjoyed that and some of you may have been bored to tears, but that is kind of what it looks like to handle carefully a difficult passage and to do our very best to try to find the real meaning and to communicate it in a good way. Next week, we'll be back to normal, me and Scott tackling the issue of worship, and we would love to have your thoughts about that as well. So tune in next week at 8:30. We'll see you then.